Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Close your eyes, the story wash over you, and drift off to sleep in peace. First, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Part 1. The world before warmth, fire, stone, and the first night, long before the first city rose, before the first field was plowed, before any word was written on any surface, there was the night, cold, absolute, and indifferent. For hundreds of thousands of years, the ancestors of modern humans faced that darkness not with technology, but with biology, ingenuity, and each other. This is the story of how they survived. Not just the hunts, not just the migrations, not just the tools, but the quiet, vulnerable hours when the sun disappeared and the temperature fell. This is the story of how ancient humans slept. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as a series of dramatic moments. First fight, the first spear, the first painting hive wall. But survival then as now was largely built from ordinary repetition, eating, moving, resting. Of these, rest was perhaps the most dangerous. To sleep is to surrender awareness. In a world where predators moved through the dark and temperatures could plunge below freer hours in a matter of hours, closing one's eyes required preparation, trust, and hard-won knowledge passed from generation to generation. The period we most associate with so-called cave people spans a remarkable breadth of human prehistory. From Homo erectus, approximate 1.9 million years ago, through the era of the Neanderthals, and into the time of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, who were painting cave walls and crafting bone, needles, as far back as 40,000 years ago. These were not brutes, they were problem solvers. And the problem of freezing to death in the night was one they solved with remarkable sophistication. To understand how they slept, we must first understand where they lived. The popular image of prehistoric humans as permanent cave dwellers is, in large part, a myth born from the preservation bias of archaeology. Caves preserve evidence, bones, charcoal, painted walls, while open-air camps of wood and hide leave almost nothing. In reality, many ancient humans lived in temporary the landscape that they provided. Mammoth bones, wooden branches, animal hides stretched over frames, rocks piled to the wind. Caves were used, certainly, but they were not universal homes. They were, more often, seasonal refuges. Places retreated when winter descended and the open steppe became unlivable. And the winters of the Pleistocene were not like the winters we know today. During the height of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, vast ice sheets covered much of Europe and North America. Average temperatures across what is now France or Germany were 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than they are today. The landscape was a periglacial steppe, treeless, wind-swept, and brutal. Woolly mammoths grazed where Paris now stands. Reindeer roamed the plains of southern Spain. In this world, the question of how to stay warm through the night was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of life and death. The first and most fundamental answer was fire. The controlled use of fire by human ancestors is one of the most consequential developments in the history of our species. not primarily because it allowed cooking, though it did, and not primarily because it had allowed tool hardening, though it did that too. Fire mattered most because it pushed back the cold. Evidence of fire use extends back at least 400 years at sites like Beech's Pit in England and Kazan Cave in Israel. And some researchers argue for controlled fire as early as 1 million years ago at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. By the time of the Neanderthals and early modern humans, fire was not a discovery. It was a technology, a practice, a social institution. In the deep chambers of caves like Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, or the Shanandar Cave in modern Iraq, the evidence of ancient hearths is unmistakable. Layers of ash and charcoal, reddened soil, burned bone. The physical signatures of fires that burned night after night, season after season, century after century. These fires served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided heat, yes, but they also provided light, which extended the productive hours of the day and allowed for tool making and social interaction after dark. They provided protection as large predators, cave lions, cave bears, hyenas, were generally deterred by flame, and they provided something perhaps less tangible but no real. A psychological center, a place of gathering, a shared warmth that was also a shared identity. Understanding how a fire actually worked as a sleeping aid requires thinking about physics. A well-maintained hearth fire in a cave could raise the ambient temperature of the surrounding space by 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. In a small cave chamber, perhaps 4 or 5 meters across, this effect was even more pronounced. The stone walls and ceiling, once warmed by hours of burning, would radiate heat into the space long after the fire itself had dimmed. This thermal mass effect meant that the temperature inside a well-chosen cave shelter could remain significantly warmer than the air outside, sometimes by as much as 15 to 20 degrees, even in the depths of winter. But fire required fuel, and fuel required labor. In a treeless, periglacial landscape, wood could be scarce. Archaeological evidence tells us that ancient humans burned more than wood. They burned bones, particularly the dense, fat-rich bones of large animals like mammoths and horses. Bone fuel burns slowly and produces a steady, sustained heat, less dramatic than a wood fire, but more consistent at sites across Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine and the Czech Republic. Archaeologists have found the remains of extraordinary structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones, with clear evidence of bone burning at their centers. These were not casual camps. They were engineered winter refuges, built by people who understood thermodynamics long before the word existed. Within these shelters, the arrangement of sleeping bodies was itself a form of thermal technology. There is abundant ethnographic evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies living in cold climates. The Inuit, the Evenki of Siberia, the San of the Kalahari in cooler seasons. That sleeping in tight groups is a primary strategy for cold survival. Body heat, shared among several individuals pressed close together, can maintain a collectively warm microclimate even when the surrounding air is frigid. Prehistoric peoples, the choice was not between sleeping alone and sleeping together. It was between sleeping together and not surviving. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. At many prehistoric sleeping sites, the spatial arrangement of hearths and sleeping surfaces suggests deliberate organization. Fire at the center or near an entrance, sleeping areas arranged around it in a roughly circular pattern, with the most vulnerable members of the group, children, the elderly, the injured, positioned closest to the heat source. This is not guesswork. It is inference drawn from the distribution of artifacts, the placement of food remains, and the configuration of stone tool-working debris, which tends to cluster near hearths where light and warmth were most available. The surfaces on which ancient humans slept all tell a story. Bare stone is a formidable heat sink. Lying on cold rock will draw energy from a human body faster than still air at the same temperature. The solution, universally adopted across human cultures in cold climates, was insulation between the body and the ground. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, researchers have found evidence of plant-based bedding dating back approximately 77,000 years. Layers of sedge grass and other vegetation, some of which appears to have been deliberately selected for medicinal or insect repellent properties. This is, to date, the oldest known evidence of constructed sleeping surfaces in the world. In colder climates, the logical extension of grass bedding was animal hide. The evidence for hide processing, perforators, the distinctive cut marks on bones, appears consistently at Neanderthal and early modern human sites across Europe and Asia by at least 40,000 years ago, and almost certainly much earlier. Ancient humans were producing tailored clothing from animal skins. The same hides that kept them warm during the day became their bedding at night, laid on the ground as a base layer to insulate from cold stone, and pulled over the body as a covering. An animal hide represents a sleeping system of remarkable effectiveness. The largest hides, those of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, could provide insulation for multiple sleeping individuals simultaneously. Smaller hides from reindeer, horses, or ibex could be layered for additional warmth. Some researchers have proposed, based on analogies with Arctic peoples, that ancient humans may have constructed rudimentary sleeping bags, hides sewn into envelope shapes, using the bone needles that appear in the archaeological record from at least 45,000 years ago. Direct evidence for this is elusive, since organic materials rarely survive tens of thousands of years. But the technology was clearly available, and the motivation would have been overwhelming. Part 2: The architecture of warmth, shelter, structure, and the engineering of survival. If fire was the engine of warmth and hides, then shelter was the architecture that made both effective. The design of prehistoric shelters, to the extent that we can reconstruct it, reveals a sophisticated understanding of wind and heat tension that required generations of accumulated knowledge to develop. Natural caves offered several thermal advantages. Their stone walls, once warmed, retained heat well. Their enclosed spaces limited aeration per wind chill that could make an open fire nearly useless in a storm. Their elevated positions, many caves open from cliff faces or hillsides, provided natural drainage, keeping the sleeping floor dry, and their limited entrances, which partially with hides or stacked stones, allowed inhabitants to control airflow that an open-air camp could not. But choosing the right cave was a science in itself. Not all caves are thermally equal. Deep chambers, far from the entrance, are insulated by the surrounding rock and maintain relatively stable temperatures year-round. Cool in summer, but far warmer than the outside air in winter. Shallow rock overhangs, contrast, offer little thermal benefit but excellent protection from precipitation. Wind direction mattered enormously. A cave entrance facing the prevailing wind direction would be cold and uncomfortable. One sheltered from the wind could be remarkably livable. The consistent selection of south or southeast-facing cave entrances across multiple prehistoric sites in Europe, positions that maximize winter solar exposure, suggests deliberate choice based on environmental knowledge. For groups living in regions without suitable caves, the construction of artificial shelters was essential. The mammoth bone structures of the Russian and Ukrainian plains, dating from approximately 15,000 to 25,000 years ago, are among the most remarkable examples. At sites like Mezhyrich in Ukraine, archaeologists have excavated the remains of elaborate circular structures from dozens of interlocking mammoth skulls, jawbones, and long bones. These were not simple windbreaks. They were engineered buildings with foundations of skulls, walls of stacked bones, and what appears to have been a superstructure of smaller bones, and tusks supporting a covering of hides. Hearths inside these structures burned bone fuel. The combination of thick hide walls, bone fuel fires, and the thermal mass of the surrounding earth would have created interior conditions warm enough for winter habitation on the open steppe. Similar structures, though less elaborately documented, are known from sites across northern Asia and into the Americas. At Terra Amata in France, a site dated to approximately 400,000 years ago, there is evidence of oval huts constructed from branches, stone weights around the perimeter, with hearths inside. This is, if the interpretation is correct, evidence of constructed shelter older than any Neanderthal site in Europe. It suggests that the engineering of warmth was not an innovation of anatomically moderns alone, but a practice with deep roots in our genus. The thermal efficiency of these structures depended heavily on their size. Small enclosures warm up faster and retain heat better than large ones, a principle that any modern camper knows intuitively. The mammoth bone structures at Mezhyrich averaged roughly 5 to 6 meters in diameter, large enough to shelter a family group of perhaps 8 to 12 individuals, but small enough to be efficiently heated by a single hearth. This size was not arbitrary. It represented an optimization. Large enough for the social group, small enough for the thermal technology available. Inside these shelters, the layout of space appears to have been organized with practical intent. Hearths are consistently found near the center or slightly off-center, positioned to maximize heat distribution while maintaining ventilation. The evidence of food processing, cracked bones, butchery marks, discarded tools, tends to cluster near the hearths, where light and warmth were available. Sleeping areas appear to have been positioned around the periphery, where the body heat of multiple individuals could be contained by the shelter walls. This arrangement has a parallel in the sleeping practices of new modern cold climate cultures. Among the traditional Inuit, for example, the sleeping platform of the igloo is elevated above the main floor, a deliberate design that takes advantage of the fact that warm air rises. Body heat from sleeping individuals, combined with a small oil lamp, could maintain the interior of an igloo at temperatures well above freezing, even when the outside air was at -40 degrees Celsius. While prehistoric humans did not build igloos, the technology requires specific snow conditions and specialized knowledge. The underlying principle of using enclosed space, and body heat as primary thermal resources was clearly understood and applied across multiple cultural traditions. The question of ventilation is more complex than it might appear. In an enclosed space, without adequate ventilation will consume available oxygen and fill the space with carbon monoxide, a potentially lethal situation. Prehistoric humans, who regularly used cave fires, clearly understood this, though their understanding was practical rather than chemical. Archaeological evidence from cave sites that fires were typically positioned near entrances or in chambers with natural ventilation, and the placement of sleeping areas farther from the entrance suggests a deliberate separation of the combustion zone from the sleeping zone. The geometry of many occupied cave chambers, a narrow entry passage opening into a wider interior chamber, naturally created airflow patterns that drew smoke out and fresh air in. In constructed shelters, the same principle applied. The mammoth bone structures, based their reconstruction, appear to have had small smoke holes or gaps in their roofing structures that allowed ventilation while mid loss. This was not accidental engineering. It was the product of long experience with fire management in enclosed spaces. Experience that came, undoubtedly, with the occasional tragic lesson. The management of fire through the night itself required a skill set that modern people rarely consider. A fire that burns too hot will consume its fuel quickly and leave the shelter cold by the early hours of the morning. A fire allowed to die completely will leave the group dependent on rekindling, a time-consuming and uncertain process. The optimal strategy, practiced by many traditional peoples, is to maintain a fire at a steady, low intensity throughout the night, sufficient to produce heat, but not so vigorous as to exhaust the fuel supply. This requires fire management, banking the coals with ash, slow combustion, adding fuel at intervals, positioning logs to burn slowly rather than rapidly. Who managed the fire through the night? This is a question that archaeology cannot answer directly. Inference and ethnographic analogy provide some guidance. In most traditional hunter-gatherer societies, fire maintenance is a communal responsibility, with individuals taking turns or waking naturally during the night to tend it. The concept of unbroken 8-hour sleep, which modern people often regard as biological default, is in fact a relatively recent cultural construct. Research by historian Roger Kirch and sleep scientists, including Siegel Jazab, has suggested that pre-industrial humans typically slept in two phases. A first sleep of several hours, a period of wakefulness, and a second sleep, a pattern well suited to the practical demands of fire maintenance. This pattern, sometimes called segmented or modal sleep, appears in the ethnographic record of numerous hunter-gatherer societies. Among the Kungsan of the Kalahari, for example, individuals commonly wake during the night, stoke the fire, converse quietly, and return to sleep. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the few remaining groups living in conditions reasonably analogous to prehistoric lifestyles, sleep staggered through the night, with rarely more than a few individuals asleep simultaneously. This staggered wakefulness serves multiple functions: fire maintenance, predator vigilance, and the social bonding that happens in the quiet hours of the night when the day's demands are suspended. Part 3. The body's own defenses, physiology, adaptation, and the biology of cold sleep. Human biology itself is not simply a passive victim of cold. Over hundreds of thousands of years of life in cold climates, natural selection has shaped our physiology in ways improved cold tolerance and cold weather sleep. These adaptations are subtle. Humans are not as cold adapted as reindeer or Arctic foxes. And they played an important role in the survival of prehistoric peoples. The most fundamental cold adaptation in humans is metabolic thermogenesis, the capacity to increase heat production through muscle activity, specifically shivering. Shivering is involuntary rapid muscle contracting that generates heat as a byproduct. It is energetically expensive. Shivering consumes calories at a rate comparable to moderate physical exercise, but it is effective, capable of maintaining core body temperature in conditions that would otherwise cause hypothermia. For a well-nourished prehistoric human, adequate body fat reserves, shivering represented a significant thermal buffer. Body fat itself is both an insulator and a fuel source. The distribution of fat in human bodies, concentrated in the trunk and around vital organs, reflects evolutionary pressure toward core temperature maintenance. Subcutaneous fat, the layer beneath the skin, slows heat loss from the body's surface to the surrounding air. For prehistoric peoples living through northern winters, the accumulation of fat reserves during the productive seasons of summer and autumn was survival imperative. Archaeological evidence of seasonal the remains of large communal hunts, the concentration of food storage pits near winter campsites, suggests prehistoric humans understood and practiced deliberate caloric loading in preparation for winter. The physiology of sleep itself also contributes to cold tolerance in ways are not immediate. During sleep, the body's metabolic rate drops by approximately 10 to 15%, reducing total heat production. This might seem counterproductive in a cold environment, but is offset by a corresponding reduction in heat loss. During sleep, the body's thermoregulatory system shifts toward vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels near the skin surface, which reduces the flow of warm blood to the extremities and minimizes heat loss through the skin. The net result is that a sleeping human curled in a protective position with arms and legs drawn toward the body's core lose less heat per hour than an inactive one, even accounting for the reduced metabolic rate. This curled sleeping position, familiar to anyone who has ever been cold in bed, is not merely instinct. It is biomechanics. The fetal position minimizes the body's area relative to its volume, which is the physical parameter that determines the rate of heat loss to the environment. By curling into a tight ball, a sleeping human can reduce their effective surface area by roughly 30 to 40% compared to a fully extended position, with a corresponding reduction in heat loss when multiple individuals sleep curled together, nested against each other like spoons. The effect is amplified as exposed skin surfaces are replaced by contact surfaces between bodies, which are near thermal equilibrium and therefore exchange almost no heat. There is also evidence that human sleep architecture, the cycling between different stages of sleep, is influenced by cold environments in ways that support survival. Rapid eye movement sleep, the stage associated with vivid dreaming, is characterized by a nearly complete suppression of thermoregulatory responses, shivering. In warm environments, this is physiologically unproblematic. In cold environments, extended periods of REM sleep without shivering could theoretically allow body temperature to drop dangerously. Some researchers have proposed that cold environments promote shorter, more fragmented REM periods, interspersed with lighter sleep stages, during which thermoregulation remains active. Whether prehistoric humans experienced systematically different sleep architecture than modern humans in heated environments remains an open question, but the biological mechanisms for such adaptation exist. Beyond physiology, clothing represented the most powerful human solution to cold weather sleep. The evidence for Paleolithic clothing is indirect. Hides decompose, and the garments themselves are never preserved, but the tools of their manufacture are bone awls and needles, hide scrapers, and the distinctive wear patterns on stone flint tools used for hide working all appear at sites across Europe and Asia from at least 45,000 years ago. And simple hide working tools are known from Neanderthal sites far older than this. The sophistication of needle technology. Thin, polished bone needles with carefully drilled eyes, indistinguishable in function from a modern sewing needle, implies the production of sewn, fitted garments rather than simple draped hides. Sun clothing is thermally superior to draped hides in one crucial respect. It eliminates the gaps and openings through which cold air can penetrate and warm air can escape. Fitted garment creates a layer of still air between the skin and the outer surface, and still air is an excellent insulator. Multiple layers of fitted garments create multiple such layers of trapped air. Principle underlying modern layered clothing systems. For sleeping, garments could be worn to bed, or supplementary sleeping covering sewn from multiple hides would have provided a level of insulation sufficient to survive even the coldest Pleistocene nights. The production of effective cold weatherments required not only the right tools but specialized knowledge of hide preparation. Raw animal hide, if simply dried, becomes stiff and brittle, cracking in cold temperatures and providing poor insulation. Brain tanning, the traditional method of curing hides using the animal's own brain tissue, which contains lecithin compounds that penetrate and soften the hide, produces a supple, durable leather that remains flexible at low temperatures and, if properly smoked, is resistant to water. Evidence that prehistoric humans practiced some form of tanning is inferred from the consistency of scraping marks on hide working tools and from the quantities of red ochre found at many sites. Ochre was used by many traditional peoples as a hide preservative and colorant. The knowledge of tanning, like the knowledge of fire management and shelter construction, was accumulated cultural technology, passed down through generations and refined over millennia. Part far, community, ritual, and the social architecture of sleep, the warmth between people. No account of prehistoric sleep would be complete without considering its social dimensions. Sleep in small hunter-gatherer groups was never merely a biological necessity. It was a social activity, embedded in relationships of trust, hierarchy, and mutual obligation that determined not only slept where, but who survived. The Hadza of Tanzania, studied extensively by sleep researcher Jerome Siegel and his colleagues, offer one of the most illuminating windows into ancestral human sleep patterns. In a landmark 2015 study published in Current Biology, Siegel's team used wrist-worn activity monitors to track the sleep patterns of Hadza individuals across multiple seasons. The findings challenged many assumptions about natural human sleep. The Hadza slept an average of only 6.5 hours per night, significantly less than the 8 hours often recommended in modern health guidelines. Their onset was typically after dark, not immediately. Social activity continued for 1 to 3 hours after sunset before sleep began. Critically, the study found that at any given moment during the night, at least 1 or 2 individuals in the wake, a pattern Siegel termed watchful sleeping, which may represent a preserved ancestral trait in which the group collectively maintained a low level of vigilance even during rest. This collective vigilance served obvious survival functions in a world where leopards and hyenas were real threats. But it also served the social function of fire maintenance and the care of vulnerable members: infants, the sick, the elderly, whose thermoregulatory capacity was less robust than that of healthy adults. The distribution of sleep across the group, rather than its concentration in a single synchronized block, created a system of mutual support that was simultaneously a predator defense, a fire-keeping system, and a caregiving network. The physical arrangement of sleeping bodies within a shelter reflected and reinforced social structure. In many traditional societies, the positions of individuals within the sleeping group are not random. They map onto relationships of kinship, alliance, and status. The warmest position, closest to the fire, most insulated from drafts, is typically occupied by infants, the elderly, or the group's socially central member. The perimeter positions, slightly colder and more exposed, are occupied by younger healthy adults who are better able to tolerate temperature variation. This is not merely a social convention, it is a survival allocation. Warm spots are a resource, and their distribution reflects the group's priorities. For Neanderthals, who lived in Europe and Western Asia from approximately 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, the evidence of social sleeping is indirect but compelling. Neanderthal sites show clear evidence of deliberate organization of living space. Hearts positioned centrally, sleeping areas apparent from the distribution of lithic debris and food remains, and evidence of care for injured and ill individuals who could not have survived without sustained support. Their group, the famous Schneider Oni individual, a Neanderthal from M cave in modern Iraq. Evidence of having survived for years with severe injuries, including a withered arm and probable blindness. Injuries that would have been immediately fatal without sustained care from others, whatever that care entailed. It almost certainly included shared sleeping warmth. The earliest symbolic objects associated with sleep and night in the archaeological record: dusted grave goods, animal teeth perforated for wearing, the placement of flowers near the dead at Shanidar, though this last interpretation remains debated, suggests that night had a significance beyond merely practical. Fire at night was not only warmth, it was for peoples who had no artificial light and no protection against darkness beyond fire itself. A symbol of safety, community, and the boundary between the known and the unknown. The circle of firelight defined the social world. Everything within it was familiar, warm, and human. Everything beyond it was dark, cold, potentially dangerous. The psychological dimension of warmth and its relationship to social bonding is not merely metaphorical. Research in social neuroscience has demonstrated that physical warmth and social warmth activate overlapping neural systems. The same brain regions involved in processing temperature also process social inclusion and exclusion. The evolutionary origins of this overlap almost certainly lie in the long human prehistory. during which the warmth of other bodies was the primary defense against cold death. To be included in the sleeping group was to be warm. To be excluded was, in the most literal possible sense, to face the cold alone. The management of this social warmth, who was included in the shelter, who was positioned near the fire, who was given the best hides, was among the most consequential social decisions a prehistoric group could make, and the norms governing these decisions, passed down through generations as part of accumulated cultural inheritance of each group, were as much a part of prehistoric survival technology as the bone needles and the fire-making tools. Part 50. Seasons, cycles, and the long night winter, preparation, and the coming of spring. The challenge of staying warm through the night was not uniform across the year. The Pleistocene world was a world of dramatic seasonal contrast, and the straws that served adequately in autumn would have been life-threatening if applied without modification to midwinter. Understanding the seasonality of prehistoric sleep strategy requires understanding the rhythm of the Pleistocene year. In the periglacial landscapes of Ice Age Europe, the annual cycle imposed a fundamental structure on human activity. Summer was the season of abundance. Plant foods were available, game was dispersed and plentiful, travel was possible, and the construction and repair of shelters and equipment could proceed without the urgency imposed by cold. The physiological priority of summer was there, and the accumulation of body fat and the privation of food stores that would sustain the group through the winter. Groups would spread out across the landscape, following game and gathering plant foods, exploiting resources that were simply not available in the cold months. As autumn arrived, the pattern shifted. Game concentrated along predictable migration route, offering opportunities for large communal hunts that provided not only meat, but the hides, sinew, and bone that would be needed for winter equipment. Evidence of mass kill sites, locations where dozens or even hundreds of animals were driven off cliffs or into natural traps, appears repeatedly in the Paleolithic record, suggesting organized communal hunting strategies whose products were preserved and stored for future use. The processing of these kills, butchery, hide removal, marrow extraction, meat preservation through drying, smoking, or freezing, was itself an undertaking that would have occupied the group for days or weeks. Winter meant a fundamental reorganization of life. Dispersed summer bands aggregate at known winter shelter sites. Caves or constructed shelters with established fuel supplies and known thermal characteristics. The social group would be larger and more densely organized in winter than in summer, as multiple family units converged on shared warm refuges. This aggregation had both thermal and social consequences. More bodies meant more shared warmth, but also more social complexity, more competition for resources, and more intensive management of social relationships within the confined space of the winter shelter. Sleep in midwinter was longer, in absolute terms, than sleep in summer. Not necessarily because, as prehistoric humans required more sleep and because the hours of darkness were longer and the opportunities for productive outdoor activity were more limited. Evidence from modern hunter-gatherer populations suggests that sleep duration follows seasonal light availability, with longer sleep periods in winter corresponding to longer nights. This is consistent with the biology of the circadian system, which is regulated primarily by light exposure, and with the practical economics of Paleolithic life. Burning fuel to extend the active hours of winter nights would have been wasteful, and activity in extreme cold without the protection of shelter was dangerous. The mental landscape of a long winter night in a Paleolithic shelter was shaped by the sensory realities of that environment. The smell of smoke and animal fat, the flickering of firelight on stone walls, the sounds of breathing, occasional coughing, the shift and crackle of burning bone, the social activities of the long winter evenings, tool making, hide working, the telling of stories, the performance of whatever social rituals bound the group together, would have continued until sleep overtook individuals one by one, the social circle gradually contracting as people withdrew to their sleeping positions. The production of cave art, one of the most astonishing and mysterious products of Paleolithic culture, was frequently undertaken deep in cave stems, far from the entrance zones used for habitation and sleeping. The caves of Lascaux, Altamira, Fond de Gaume, and contain their painted panels dozens or hundreds of meters from the cave mouth, chambers accessible only by long passages that required the carrying of fire for light. Whatever the purpose of this art, and its interpretation remains contested, ranging from hunting magic to shamanic vision to pure aesthetic expression. Its production required deliberate expeditions into the darkness, carrying fire into the earth. The relationship between these journeys into the cold dark of cave interiors and the social life of the warm, firelit entrance chambers is a mystery that archaeology cannot resolve, but it reminds us that the relationship between prehistoric peoples and the darkness of the night was complex, active, culturally elaborated, in ways that extended far beyond mere survival. Part 6. Neanderthals and the question: another kind of sleep. The people who came before. No discussion of prehistoric sleep would be complete without specific attention to the Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary relatives, who shared Europe and Western Asia with early modern humans for thousands of years before their disappearance, approximately 40,000 years ago. Neanderthals are among the most studied and most debated figures in human prehistory, and the question of how they experienced and managed sleep reveals both the similarities and the differences between them and us. Neanderthals were, in physical terms, remarkably well suited to cold climates. Their bodies show the classic morphology associated with cold adaptation. Short, stocky, wide trunks, short limbs, and large nasal passages that warmed and humidified cold air before it reached the lungs. Their barrel-shaped chests enclosed large lung volumes, and their limb proportions, relatively short forearms and lower legs compared to their upper limbs, minimized heat loss from the extremities. The pattern predicted by Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule for cold-adapted mammals. By some estimates, Neanderthal metabolic rates were significantly higher than those of modern humans, an evolutionary response to the caloric demands of maintaining core temperature in cold conditions, which would have meant that a resting, weeping Neanderthal generated substantially more body heat than a modern human of comparable size. Neanderthals controlled fire. At sites like Le Moustier in France and Kibara Cave in Israel, there is clear evidence of hearths maintained over it for extended periods, with the same evidence of deliberate fuel management visible at anatomically modern human sites. Neanderthals also processed hides. Their lithic toolkit included side scrapers, whose use-wear patterns are consistent with hide working, and they appear to have used plant materials for comfort and possibly medicine, as suggested by the high concentrations of medicinal plants found near the boreal. What distinguished Neanderthal shelter use from that of early modern humans remains a matter of active research and debate. Some scholars have argued that Neanderthals were less systematic in their use of space within caves, that their living areas show less clear spatial organization of activities than those of modern humans. Others have challenged this interpretation, pointing to evidence of deliberate spatial organization at several Neanderthal sites. What seems clear is that Neanderthals were fully capable of creating and maintaining the conditions necessary for warm, safe sleep in cold climates, and that they did so effectively for hundreds of thousands of years across some of the harshest environments of Pleistocene Europe. The extinction of the Neanderthals remains one of the grave mysteries of human prehistory. Climate change, competition with modern humans, disease, and interbreeding have all been proposed as contributing factors, and the current evidence suggests that all of these played some role. Modern humans of non-African ancestry carry, on average, 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. The genetic of interbreeding events that occurred during the thousands of years when the two populations overlapped in Europe and the Middle East. Some of this Neanderthal genetic inheritance to immune function, some of it may relate to metabolism and cold tolerance. In a very real sense, the Neanderthal solution to the problem of staying warm, a solution encoded in their biology as well as their culture, lives on in the genes of billions of modern humans. Part 7. The inheritance of cold. Ancient nights left in us. This extraordinary arc of human prehistory. From the first controlled fires of Homo erectus to the elaborately constructed winter camps of the late Paleolithic, represents not merely a series of individual innovations, but a cumulative cultural inheritance. Each generation building on the knowledge of the last. The strategies for surviving cold nights that we have traced through account: fire, shelter, clothing, communal sleeping, social organization, were not invented once and then simply maintained. They were continuously refined, adapted to new environments and new conditions. and transmitted through the most basic of human channels: direct observation, imitation, and instruction. This transmission was not guaranteed. Each generation had to learn, either from their elders or from painful experience, specific knowledge required to survive in their particular environment. The loss of a senior knowledge holder to accident or illness could deprive a group of or replace expertise, knowledge of the best shelter sites, fuel sources, the specific techniques for processing hides to maximum flexibility, the management of fire in enclosed spaces. The vulnerability of cultural knowledge to disruption was arguably as great a survival risk as the vulnerability of individual bodies to cold. It is worth pausing near the end of this account to consider what these ancient solutions to the problem of cold sleep have left us. Modern humans in industrial societies sleep in heated rooms, under manufactured textile, or on engineered mattresses, separated from the cold by layers of technology, so effective that most of us never seriously confront the physiological challenge that was the nightly reality of our ancestors. Yet the biology that underlies our sleep has not changed significantly in 300,000 years. Our thermoregulatory systems, our circadian rhythms, our social bonding through shared warmth, all of these are inherited from ancestors whose relationship with the cold night was intimate and urgent. The preference for sleeping curled with another person, as universal as merely romantic, is at its origin a survival behavior. Two bodies retain warmth better than one. The comfort of a warm drink before sleep, the discomfort of sleeping in a cold room, the way that cold air sharpens wakefulness and warmth induces drowsiness. All of these are the physiological OOs of a long evolutionary history, during which the management of sleep temperature was a matter of life and death. The segmented sleep pattern, the waking in the early hours of the night, that so many modern people experience as a pathological disruption, may be, as Roger E. Kirch and others have argued, the ghost of a bimodal sleep pattern, adapted to a world in which fire needed tending and predators needed watching. The social richness of nighttime in traditional cultures, the storytelling, social bonding, the rituals and conversations that happen around the fire after the sun has set, is not a compensation for the tedium of darkness. It is the cultural elaboration of the long collaborative vigil through the cold night that was the fundamental condition of human social life for most of our species' history. And the caves themselves, Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, the hundreds of painted caves whose walls record the inner life of Paleolithic peoples with astonishing vividness, were not merely shelters. They were the sites where human social and cultural life was most intensively concentrated, the places where the warmth of fire and the warmth of community combined to create the conditions under which culture could grow. The paintings on their walls were not made by people merely trying to survive. They were made by people who had solved the problem of survival well enough to have time and energy for something more, for beauty, B, for meaning, for the elaboration of a shared imaginative world. That fire and community. And the long winter nights had made possible. Epilogue. The last fire, a night unchanged. It is perhaps 20,000 years ago, somewhere in what will one day be called France. A small group of people, 7 adults, 3 children, 1 elderly woman whose knowledge of plant medicines is irreplaceable, huddles in the mouth of a shallow cave overlooking a frozen river valley. Outside, the temperature is minus 20 degrees Celsius. The wind drives loose snow horizontally across the steppe. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, a cave hyena moves. Inside, the fire burns steadily, its fuel of horse rib bones broken and arranged to burn slowly through the night. The sleeping group arranged in a rough semicircle around the warmest zone. The 2 youngest children pressed against their mother's body, wrapped in reindeer hides that have been worked soft and supple over many hours of patient labor. The elderly woman sleeps closest to the fire, her breathing slow and even. The 2 strongest adults lie slightly apart on the perimeter of the group, their sleep lighter, closer to wakefulness. One of the perimeter adults opens his eyes after some hours. The fire has dimmed. He rises quietly without waking the others and adds bone fuel to the coals, watching the flames recover. He stands for a moment, listening to the wind and the breathing of his group. Everything as it should be. He returns to his place, curls around the warm body next to him, and closes his eyes. In this unremarkable moment, repeated 10,000 times in 10,000 shelters across the glaciated, weighted world, lies the whole of what we have tried to understand. Fire, community, trust, the extraordinary, ordinary machinery of human survival. We are the descendants of the people who kept the fire burning.